and I am an independent reader, writer, podcaster, thinker. I don't know how to describe myself. I was doing a podcast with my friend Delia yesterday, and we talked a little bit about different types of labels and what it means to be a philologist versus a writer versus various other things. Today, I'm going to talk to you about Edward Slingerland's new book. I think it came out last year in some places. It is called Drunk, and it is a book about the history of intoxicants. I am very lucky to be meeting Edward today. I think he goes by Ted. And so he and I are going to be hosting an event through the Intellect, which is a discussion of his book and about, by extension, the history of intoxicants. So even though the book is called Drunk, and I was going to try and pull up the full title. So it's called, the full title is, the subtitle is How We Sipped, Danced, and Stumbled Our Way to Civilization with author Edward Slingerland. That's the name of the event that I'm doing today. There's sort of like 20-something people signed up, and so I'm quite excited just to be able to do that and to meet him, which has been all possible through the Intellect, or the II as it is called. So before I get started on talking about this, I am going to just tweet that I am actually doing this. So you'll have to bear with me for a second because I'm in this mode where I just don't edit anything. And so, yeah, if you're watching this later, I'll give you a timestamp in the YouTube video whereby you can later, sorry, you're going to get some echo of me there. Whereby you can later just start watching the actual discussion. But for now, I am going to tweet that this is a thing that is happening right now. So the background, as I said, it's through the Intellect that I've been able to host this event with Edward. I'm not quite sure whether to call him Edward or Ted. And I read the book over the past week or so. Okay. I actually don't know how long the physical book is because it's still in the post, actually. So I got the Kindle version and was making notes on that. I've got, 254 highlights for his book, which is a good sign. It means it was an interesting book. That's a lot. And I really learned a lot from it as well. The central question of the book is, why do we get drunk if it seems to kind of be bad for us? Like, why have we evolved this? Why have we not evolved not to drink if drinking seems to be so harmful? And so he spends the first chapter on this question of like, the original assumptions are that this is some kind of evolutionary hangover, or so. By original assumptions, I don't mean his assumptions. I mean the kind of mainstream explanation of, let's say, evolutionary psychology, which I think is, I'm not exactly sure who would represent this, but no, I am not the author of this book, actually. So the book is called Drunk, and it is by an author called Edward Slingerland, and I'm hosting an event with him later today in London. And there's also going to be an online event with him on the 17th of September. So I will post a link to that in the chat. In fact, maybe I'll do that now, just in case it's relevant. So the question is, what are the overall kind of mainstream descriptions of why we drink? And it's worth saying at this point that it is really a history of intoxicants. So that although it focuses on alcohol, that's really because alcohol is the most widely used. Almost every culture on earth has alcohol, even if they have rules saying you shouldn't drink it in this situation or that situation, or even if you have a large percentage of the population who is teetotal or abstinent, it's almost a cultural universal to have alcohol. And if you don't have alcohol, the cultures that don't have alcohol tend to have some other intoxicant that they use. And it's just not common for there to be absolutely zero alcohol within a society. There may be strong cultural norms that you don't drink, or that only certain classes drink, or it's unpious to drink, or things like that. But total abstinence is rare. So I'm going to post that link to the online event, which is coming up in September. So he starts out with the kind of mainstream, as I said, view, which is that it's kind of a mistake that we like alcohol. And so there's two ways you could kind of argue this, and he calls them the hijack theory and the what is the other one? It's the hijack theory or the hangover theory. And by hijack, he means we have this kind of reward system that tries to motivate us to do things. But sometimes we can get that reward without actually doing the thing that it's supposed to motivate us to do, right? So the example he gives is masturbation, which is basically the reward of orgasm is to have sex. And the reason that evolution, quote unquote, wants you to have sex, even though of course evolution doesn't want anything, this is just speaking in a kind of shorthand. The reason that it would make sense to reward that behavior is because if you do that behavior, that gene, your genes are more likely to persist, which is you have children. And so the hijack theory is basically saying that we have these kind of neurotransmitters or whatever in our brain. I mean, alcohol, it's worth saying, really interacts with body chemistry in like a very fundamental way. It's not like some other drugs, for example, LSD, even cocaine, nicotine, they're much more targeted, whereas alcohol messes with like every system in the body, basically. And by extension, almost every system in the mind. So I'm not being intentionally vague. Like I'm sure like it interacts with dopamine. It interacts with GABA, which is kind of like the sedation thing, and with serotonin as well. So it's really like a kind of sledgehammer approach to changing your mood. And so the hijack theory would say, just like masturbation, it's just this kind of random thing that alcohol happens to trigger some kind of reward, and that's why we like it. It's actually like not adaptive, but it is a thing that has kind of happened through the way that evolution works. The other kind of mainstream evolutionary theory point is called the hangover theory. And this is not, I drank too much last night kind of hangover, but just the idea that this behavior used to be adaptive. And even though it's no longer adaptive, it's still something that evolution has kept around just kind of by accident. So it might be that, at a certain point in the past, we evolved the ability to tolerate alcohol, because it's worth saying at the start that alcohol is very toxic and not every animal can take in alcohol and process it. So it looks like humans kind of got this special ability. It's not that other animals don't ever use alcohol, by the way, other primates. And I think even bears also drink. I'm not sure if he talks about that, but they're like other mammals for sure. And I think even other just animals in general. So Yeah, in fact, I'm certain of that because Slingerland talks a lot about the question of fruit flies. And so they show similar behavior when they get slightly tipsy, which is also kind of interesting. So at the same time, humans seem to have changed to be able to tolerate more alcohol than they used to. So then that's a kind of also like, it doesn't seem to sit well with the idea that, okay, the reason we have tolerance for alcohol is because we need to eat slightly overripe fruits, which is like, these fruits that have kind of gone past their whatever sell by date, but we still want to eat them because they still have calories. And they also have this neurotoxin, which is called alcohol. But, one theory might be that we actually got this adaptation in order to be able to eat those kind of overripe fruits. Now, this, and then the other sort of like, so again, he calls these hijack theories, like, alcohol is kind of like just triggering some reward center in the same way that masturbation does. And it's not actually probably evolutionarily advantageous. And the other one is the hangover theory, which is that it used to make sense that we could drink, but that we needed to be able to tolerate alcohol to eat like overripe fruit, maybe when it was harder to find food, but now it like kind of doesn't make sense. But there's a bunch of problems with both of these views. And so basically Slingerland is kind of saying it's not either one of those. So he thinks there needs to be a better explanation of what the pros of alcohol are, because we kind of all know what the cons are, as in, hangovers in today's society, drunk driving, alcoholism, it messes up your liver, it messes up your kidneys, it really messes up a lot of things, and it directly impairs you in the moment. So it would seem like that would not be a thing that in evolutionary time that you would normally want. So, let's say you are like, there's all kinds of threats in the kind of evolutionary environment, at least in the story typically told by sort of evolutionary psychologists. And so being impaired at any point, and it's very clear that even at small amounts, alcohol does impair us. This is why we can't operate heavy machinery or drink or do other things that require focus, attention, like, that kind of thing. So Slingerland's main question is, how has it happened that we have become animals that not only can tolerate alcohol, but seem to like it? Like we said at the beginning, even if not every individual drinks it, at the societal level, pretty much every society has it. And the ones that often don't have it, not because it's not available, but because it looks like like having alcohol in your blood can make certain other neurotoxins more dangerous. So I think he talks about people in the Polynesian islands who eat some kind of shellfish and if you combine something that's in this shellfish with alcohol, it's quite dangerous. And the end result is that it's not that they stay sober, it's that they eat these kava leaves, basically. So that's a kind of overall introduction into what he's trying to do with this book. Right there, I'm going to like kind of raise a question of my own, which is, it seems to me like if I had to just guess, and this is something I have thought about, why alcohol tolerance would be selected for in evolutionary terms, it would probably be because it actually is conducive to having children. So like, in other words, maybe it raises the number of partners you have in your life or something like that. And even though alcoholism is very dangerous, if it's dangerous to the individual, but the individual still is able to have children, then it's very hard for evolution to select against that, right? So that's one question that I want to ask him tonight. So yeah, I'm gonna I I have so many highlights. I'm not like really sure where to go through this. I'm going to try and scroll through some of my notes and just bring up points that he's made. So one is that in addition to being a cultural universal, as in pretty much every society drinks. Again, not every individual drinks, but at the level of the society they do. And so, and the other issue is just the antiquity of drinking, as in it seems to be very, very old. It may be older than agriculture. So there's quite a few people, and Slingerland goes into this, who are, and I'm not going to do any citations because I can't do that off the top of my head, but I will just describe it to you. And if you're interested, the book is very, very well referenced. But there's a number of paleontologists, historians, anthropologists who have what's called a beer before bread theory. And what that means is the standard story of agriculture is that humans are in this precarious position in the sense that they don't have easy access to food, or it's not reliable, and so they're always looking for food. Food's always a problem. There are these routine famines. So they notice that if they take the seeds from, let's say, some grass that produces some kind of calories they can use, and then they spread that grass, then that grass will grow everywhere, and humans can kind of slowly take the increase in calories that comes from this kind of proto-agriculture model where all you're doing is you're taking the things you like and kind of spreading their seeds throughout the world. This is not an uncontroversial description of how even like another possibility is that the grass is spread through what are called ungulates, like cattle, basically, and that humans have less of a role in spreading them. But let's just stick with the standard story and say that humans realize they like wheat, let's say. And so then when they eat it, they're like, okay, we'll also scatter the seeds. And then more and more wheat grows, right? And then eventually you kind of get these societies that settle down near the wheat and they become sedentary. Now, and the understanding in that story is that the reason they want to grow wheat is to make bread, right? That you can take these kind of live plants, which, let's say you're growing fruit, like fruit, if you just have it and then don't do anything with it, it kind of goes bad, right? Like, whereas, if you can get to the point of flour keeps for a lot longer than fruit does. And maybe there's something about preservation. Maybe there's just something about the ease of gathering wheat that's kind of nearby and available. But the point is that the standard story, insofar as there is one, is that humans start cultivating grasses, wheat and barley, in order to make bread, right? That they're, or other foods that are kind of bread-like, right? That involve these kernels from these grasses. The people that espouse the beer before bread theory say that actually the reason why agriculture starts is because humans realize that with the kind of complex carbohydrates that you get in grasses, you can actually produce intoxicants. Specifically, you can produce alcohol, right? And so in this telling, alcohol comes before bread. So that's why it's called beer before bread. And you might think that sounds crazy. Isn't food more important than alcohol? And the question there is kind of like, important for what? So one possibility is it's important for just staying alive, right? And bread is clearly that. Another possibility is that it's important for some other reason. And this is where I'm going to kind of get into like spoilers about what Slingerland's argument is like. Just a second. So to continue on that point, what would the benefits of alcohol be? The simplest way to frame Slingerland's argument is probably just to say that it brings people together. And so it allows us to cooperate. It kind of suspends what the PFC, as he calls it, the prefrontal cortex. So these parts of the brain that are very late, that kind of cause you to be logical and rational, and to do all kinds of for planning, thinking about yourself, thinking about the past, all these kind of things. And alcohol attenuates the role of the prefrontal cortex. Now, why would you want to do this? There's a number of reasons, as Slingerland argues in the book. One would be just not worrying about tomorrow or the past, basically. So it does a pretty good job. He calls it, I think, alcohol-induced myopia. Myopia is just, like not being able to see very far. I don't think he's like strictly talking about time in that sense. It's like when you're drinking, you're just kind of very focused on what's in front of you. And it's very hard for you to be aware of what's going on around you. And so if you're with other people, if you're ever sober and you're around drunk people, you may notice this, which is like, if you're sober and you try to walk past someone who's sober, then it's very easy. They notice you're there, they get out of your way, and it's this kind of very responsive automatic thing that happens. If you try to walk past someone who's very drunk, they will not register that you're there, and not really. It's like hard, you have to kind of make them aware that you're trying to come through, and so that would just be an example of myopia. Why would we want myopia? Well, on the time scale, it might be nice to not always be worrying about the future and the past. And it might also be nice to get rid of a kind of strong sense of self. And why would it be good to get rid of a strong sense of self? Well, one is just communal bonding, right? That if we're kind of being less selfish, and, you can imagine the kind of drunken hugs at the end of the night kind of thing, which is that it makes you more trusting to strangers. It makes you more childlike in some ways. And Slingerland talks at length about that topic, juvenescence, or I think he calls it neoteny. And that neoteny is just like the tendency of an adult organism to appear young, and so or to remain in a kind of immature form. And I've talked about that a little bit before on here, I think. And it's just this idea that maybe humans are kind of like staying in this youthful state. And why might we want to do that? Well, one is that typically youth is like a plastic state, right? It's easier to learn. If you have tried to learn a language past the age of 14, then you know that once your brain is kind of more wired up, it's actually harder to learn a language than it is when you're an infant. I mean, children spend a lot of time learning languages, and I'm not saying it's easy for them, but they do seem to be able to do it, and pretty quickly, and without apparent huge amounts of pain. Although, maybe that pain just gets kind of displaced into other kind of behaviors. I don't know. So neoteny is just the idea that maybe one advantage of reducing the activity of the prefrontal cortex and becoming less adult, less rational and coldly calculating, maybe, and becoming more trusting, more capable of learning, and Slingerland argues maybe even more creative. So people who have had a drink or two do better on these kind of artificial tests that are set up to test creativity, basically. So like, let's say you are trying to, like, it's often they're like problem solving things, like, okay, how do you, there's like a famous one with a candle. I'm not going to be able to remember exactly what the details of it are, but basically you give people a kind of difficult problem where they need to do all kinds of lateral or weird thinking, and, see how many ideas they can generate. And I think that on one or two drinks, and it's important that it's one or two drinks, not like 10 or 20, or even like 3 or 4, because this kind of creativity spike like goes down very quickly. That this is also adaptive. And the other thing is that he goes into this quite a long section, which is fascinating, but it's a little hard. I found it a little hard to follow. It's about the issue of honesty. So basically, it's actually harder to lie, and it's like easier to detect lies, I think, when you are drinking. And so basically this idea that some drinkers have, and whether you're a drinker or not, you may have experienced this, which is that people who don't drink in a drinking context are sometimes not trusted. And it's like thought, well, why are they not drinking, or what are they worried about, or are they really trustworthy? And so this kind of relates to this idea of in vino veritas, which is in wine truth, just the idea that somehow drinking brings out the truth or the true nature of people or something like that. I think that there's a few reasons that I have questions about that. One is like, wouldn't that just produce an arms race between like lying and truth telling? I think Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book about this that I read. It's not massively memorable, but it was also called Talking to Strangers. It was called Talking to Strangers, and it is, I know it does talk about alcohol in a bunch of different contexts. So yeah. So his central claim, and I did tweet this, and so if you're like I'm kind of the kind of person who is like, I don't want to read reviews before books. I kind of want to make up my own mind. And I feel like if someone tells me the punchline before I hear the joke or whatever, I get a little bit annoyed. I do feel like this punchline and spoiler thing are kind of related somehow. I hadn't really thought about that before. But I'm going to read out one sentence that's quite central, and that's from his introduction. So Slingerland writes, and this is in the book Drunk: the cost of indulgence has to be balanced. So basically, we've kind of talked about alcoholism causes car accidents, crime. It causes self-harm. It's quite linked with suicidality. It causes it causes huge medical bills. It causes liver failure. It causes other organ failure. You can literally just straight up die, especially with spirits, from drinking it. A lot of that is not super widely publicized because, there's kind of society is at least the society that I live in, which is in the UK. The society is very pro drinking. So, there's kind of around the edges, they tell you these things. Oh yeah, you should watch your drinking, don't drink too much, etc. But it's not like, it's rarely foregrounded, like something like the fact that a large percentage of suicides involve alcohol, and alcoholics are very likely, like compared to the general population, they're far more likely to commit suicide than other people. So there are these huge costs to indulgence. So I'm going to return to the quote. Sorry about that. The cost of indulgence has to be balanced by specific targeted benefits. The book argues that, far from being an evolutionary mistake, chemical intoxication helps solve a number of distinctively human challenges, right? So this is Slingerland's book argues, this is the central argument, that chemical intoxication, so not just being drunk, but other drugs as well, solve a number of distinctively human challenges. One, he doesn't list these with numbers, but I'm going to list them as numbers for dramatic effect. 1, enhancing creativity. 2, alleviating stress. 3, building trust. And 4, pulling off the miracle of getting fiercely tribal primates to cooperate with strangers. So again, that talking to strangers thing. The desire to get drunk, along with the individual and social benefits provided by drunkenness, played a crucial role, argues Slingerland, in sparking the rise of the first large-scale societies. We could not have civilization without intoxication. So this is a big claim, right? It's basically saying that the basis of civilization is not, the desire to become civilized. The basis of civilization, in Slingerland's telling, and I'm sympathetic to this view, is the desire to get intoxicated. And why do we want to get intoxicated? Again, it allows us to operate in larger groups. I think, he does talk about this a little in the book, but maybe it's not central. It allows us to tolerate higher levels of stress. He does talk about this. He talks about this rat study, which is that if you take rats and you kind of feed them well and give them a environment that they like, where they can play and they get social contact and things like that, then in general, rats don't get addicted to alcohol. Whereas if you put them in with a bunch of other aggressive rats and you don't give them enough space and they're constantly fighting and you don't let them sleep enough and things like that, then they resort more to alcohol. So you could just say, that the density of society, the fact that we don't sleep as much as we should, the fact that we don't eat and exercise the way that we should, and the fact that there's just all kinds of stress, right, that weren't there in the evolutionary environment, might make us more prone rather than less prone to needing some way of relieving stress, right? So that is a point that he makes, and I'm just kind of expanding it a little bit. He goes into a little bit about why alcohol rather than psychedelics or other drugs. Some of those drugs really knock you out and they last a lot longer and you kind of can't function. And so even though they may have similar overall effects, I mean, in many ways they don't have specifically in terms of the brain like that similar of effects. But if you're talking about something really general, which is just kind of like altering my state or reducing my stress or kind of, like at those very, very high level, what does it do? Then you could argue that, yes, cannabis does this. Yes, on a long enough time scale, psychedelics do this, alcohol does this, even though each of them is quite different in terms of its pharmacology. And so why don't we just, on every weekend, at the end of the day, rather than going to the pub, just like take a huge whack of acid. Well, acid like really messes, like it's quite extreme what it does. And it's far beyond, now there's this thing of microdosing, which he talks a little bit about, but in general, in the kind of doses of hallucinogens / psychedelics, people don't really tend to function well enough to kind of get this benefit of communal stuff. It's just too extreme is what he thinks. Other things, like he doesn't talk a huge amount about nicotine. Nicotine, I would have thought, could relieve stress, but it also becomes very addictive. So it may just like raise baseline stress levels, fairly rapidly. So it doesn't kind of work anymore. Alcohol does seem to work for a long time. I don't really know exactly what to make of that. As in, like, you can drink for many years and eventually get to the point where it no longer really does the stress reducing thing, but it is able to do that for a long time in a way that, you know what I mean? Like, let's just say it this way, which is, in general, people who drink alcohol tend to have like reasons, like they think there are benefits and there are costs. Most people I know who have been long-term smokers kind of say that there isn't really a benefit for them anymore. And so you're like, why do they do it? And they're like, well, I just can't seem to stop, whereas if you ask people like, why do you drink alcohol? They are much more, they seem to like it, right? Whereas if you've been smoking cigarettes for 10 years, a lot of times you don't like it, or at least it seems like people don't like it. Maybe that's a cultural thing. I actually don't know. So, and those are just kind of like, even within what I'm talking about, like we're talking about the common drugs that are available. And that's already like been through a huge selection process. He talks about, these kind of beans where you have to get the dosage exactly right. Otherwise you have nausea, vomiting, headaches, sweating, salivation, diarrhea, convulsions, and paralysis of the respiratory muscles, if you get the dose like slightly wrong. So it's like, you can imagine that this is not, it's just too much, basically. Medicinal properties. So the first chapter is called Why Do We Get Drunk? And I feel like I've kind of argued that. he goes into one of the other things that's brilliant about this book is he knows a very, very wide range of cultures. So he's not only focusing on Western cultures. First of all, he originally Edward Slingerland, I'll just say in case you come in the middle of this, was originally a professor. I think he still is a professor of Chinese philosophy, which is actually fascinating to me. I studied English literature, but like I did one class on Chinese intellectual history in undergrad, and Slingerland actually knows the professor who taught me one of my favorite Chinese philosophers, who I may even have mentioned on one of these live streams, called Zhuangzi. And Zhuangzi is fantastic. And I've just learned that that Edward, if you don't know Zhuangzi, please, look him up. Or actually, what I might do is I could probably link you to a post that I've done on Zhuangzi. Sorry, this is boring, I know. But it's I'm trying to be of benefit to you. So, okay, it's called Knowledge. I'm going to post a link to my blog, which is about infinite knowledge. So, okay, so Slingerland knows really a lot about cultural history, and he really goes into a bunch. I'm just like looking through this, he's talking about the Czech thinker who's saying that a nation which drinks more will undoubtedly succumb to, okay, so this is something that he doesn't believe. A nation which drinks more will undoubtedly succumb to one that is more sober. And he points out that the Czech Republic still drinks quite a lot. And so let's see. He's saying that they're one of the highest per capita. So if it were true that a more sober nation would prevail, then why aren't there more sober nations? There are kind of no sober nations. Like I said, there's a few of these kind of Polynesian islands. Maybe they are island nations. I could be wrong. I would like actually to find that quote, because it is a kind of interesting point that most societies do use alcohol. No, I don't think I have it here. So he's talking about psychedelics. So he does go into the fact that, sorry, I'm not being very coherent. What I'm saying is that the book is like a pleasure to read, because it's not just him kind of arguing his point. He cites an absolutely enormous array of cultural evidence, including from ancient China, because that's the period of Chinese philosophy that he was working on. Pretty much every European country, like I said, the Polynesian islands, like he's looking at, he's looking at issues of Mormonism, and they kind of tried to ban it, and even other animals. Do other animals get messed up? So it's an absolute pleasure to read. There are like a number of other things that are really interesting. One is that he thinks that distilled spirits are extremely dangerous, like that they're very new, evolutionarily speaking. The oldest ones are kind of like, maybe they're starting to do a bit of stills. Stills are what's used for distillation to make stronger drinks. So there's two ways of doing this. He doesn't call it freeze distillation. He calls it something else. But you can take alcohol and freeze it if you're in a place that's cold enough, and remove, because alcohol and water freeze at different temperatures, you can remove the ice, and then you end up with a stronger drink. He says this intensifies toxins, and this is why no one does it anymore. I actually am not sure if no one does this anymore. Isn't this what an ice vine is? Like, I can look it up right now. Yeah, that is what an ice vine is. So, oh no. Ice vine is when the grapes have been frozen on on the vine. Okay. Yeah, interesting. So that makes them stronger. So what am I going to say about that? So because there wasn't really widespread use of distilled spirits, which are like, so if you drink, you probably know this, but like a beer in the like medieval period, says Slingerland, and I've heard mixed things about how strong beer has been over the course of the last 1,000 years. It's often said that there's this kind of like table beer that's like 2 or 3%, and that lots of people in Europe drink that preferentially to water because alcohol is a very good way. It's a very good disinfectant. So there's two reasons for this. One is if water is really actually, this might be three. I'm going to make up the first one. I have no idea if this is true, but I'm going to say it anyway. One is if the water is truly contaminated and like really deadly, yeast can't grow in it. So the beer won't be made properly. I've never heard anyone say that before, but having done some home brewing myself, it might be true. Second thing is alcohol itself, which is basically uses yeast to break down these complex carbohydrates. They don't have to be complex, but most, it's not even true. I was going to say most carbohydrates in nature are complex. That's not really true. So in beer, like wheat and barley, etc., those are complex carbohydrates, and that's why when they ferment, beer is always sweet at the end, because some of those complex carbohydrates, they're these long saccharide chains, and they yeast typically can't fully break them all down. So you're always going to have this residual sweetness, and there's always a need, or there always, as far as I know, there's always been a need with beer to reduce the sweetness by including a bitter element. I believe in the Reformation, in the German Reinheitsgebot, I think it's in the 15th century, they introduced hops, which is like most beers that you drink today. If you don't know what's in it, it's going to be water, barley, maybe wheat, maybe a few other things, but in general, it's barley, because barley has these properties of filtering really well. Filtering what's called the wort, which is like the unfermented liquor is probably the right word, but it's not what we typically mean by liquor today. So you've got water, barley, or rather the kind of result of heating the barley in water and then draining it off and filtering all the barley out, and then you just get this liquid that's very sweet because it's got all these complex carbohydrates. The yeast, which breaks down the simple and least complex carbohydrates into alcohol and other things, and then hops. And hops are themselves like mildly psychoactive. I think they're related to cannabis, actually, but they're also bitter, right? So you've got this issue of how do we balance out the sweetness. Now with wine, you don't necessarily have this problem, because I was about to say nature is all complex carbohydrates, which is bullshit, because fruits, I'm pretty sure fructose is just at least it's far simpler than whatever's going on in potatoes and, things like that. It's not a starch, right? So wine can be dry. Beer cannot actually be very dry. There's ways of getting it drier, but in general, there's always some level of sweetness to beers. Maybe there's always some level of sweetness to wines. I don't know. Wines can be pretty dry though, can't they? I feel like yes. Okay. So carrying on. Yeah. So one thing is that distillation is a very recent process, like last 1,000 years. And in most places, they didn't really properly get it until like the 17th, 18th century. And when places start getting it, you get this gin craze in London and maybe the rest of the UK. It's something to do with William of Orange, who comes over from the Netherlands. And the Netherlands is actually the place that invents gin. There's a thing called Jenever, which you can still get. And basically it gets taken across. And I think what happens is William of Orange relaxes the tax on gin, and then immediately everyone over the age of like 5 is drinking like a gallon of gin a day, and it causes huge societal problems. One other thing that I would actually like to ask Slingerland is, do we see this effect replicated? I would expect this to kind of happen, like you can think of indigenous cultures that when they're exposed to distilled spirits, like they're just exposed to that at the same time as a bunch of other, things that tend to mess up their societies, like Christian missionaries or, like new nation state governments that are trying to like do things that are different from the traditional ways. But it's just clear that alcohol has done a lot of damage to Aboriginal societies as well as like kind of, I'm sure, Native American societies in America, like First Nations. I'm not quite sure what the terms are in each of these places, but I would expect a similar kind of like chaos and destruction to reign wherever a people has never tasted distilled spirits and then they're suddenly introduced to it. And Slingerland seems to think this is true as well. One thing he points out is that Asian flushing, which is a kind of losing a gene in order to lose tolerance to alcohol, and then it makes it really not fun to drink it, occurs in China, where actually distillation looks like it happens a few hundred years earlier than it does in the West. So it may be that that's an adaptation to stop us from drinking something that is, on the whole, like very destructive. And if it's going to work that way, then I guess it would have to like kind of tend to destroy people before they have children, right? And Slingerland points out that with beer and wine, it's nigh on impossible to kill yourself just by drinking beer. Of course, you can drink beer and get in a car accident or whatever, but you're not going to get the level of alcohol poisoning you would need. For one thing, beer just takes up a lot of volume. You're very likely to vomit. The same apparently goes for wine. I hadn't really heard this, but apparently, like for the really, really dangerous stuff, you kind of need spirits. I don't know anything about that. Like, I don't want to make that claim if it's not true, but I kind of started to say earlier, so beer used to be maybe 2-3% in the Middle Ages. I've heard that at least in the UK, it had gone up to like 7-9% by the 19th century. That could be wrong. Definitely was reduced by the Defense of the Realm Act, and the kind of normal, quote unquote normal, like today, if you buy a beer, it's likely to be 4 or 5%. If it's 6%, we would be like, oh, that's unusually strong. If it's 3%, it would be like, okay, that's kind of weak. Maybe like 3.9 to like 5.5% would be like a normal range for beer. I never drank much wine, so I don't really know the range exactly, but I would guess it's something like 11%. I know there are some Australian wines that go up to like 16%. Slingerland talks about those, but I would guess that the kind of general range, old world 11%, maybe 10.5. I don't know. Maybe it goes down to 10. I don't know. And then up to about 14.5. I think it would be pretty unusual to see a 15% wine, I think. Fortified wine is different. So that's when you add spirits into the wine either before or after it's finished fermenting. So if you add the distilled spirits to wine before it's done finishing, then you end up with port, which is always sweet. And then if you add it to the wine after it's done fermenting, then you get sherry, which can be dry or sweet, if that makes sense. The point being that at the start of any fermentation process, you have this very sweet liquid, and at the end you have a less sweet liquid, but with alcohol. And so if you let that process go to the end, like I was talking about with wine, you can end up with a very dry wine. And so if you stop that here, then you'll end up with more sweetness. And that's what port is. And if you stop it here, then you end up with sherry, which is which is less sweet, but then you can add sugar back if you want it to get sweeter. And the reason this works, the reason it freezes, so most Saccharomyces cerevisiae is the yeast that's used. It's both brewer's yeast and baker's yeast, but there's different strains that are optimized for different things, right? So brewer's yeast, these are both types of fungi, single-celled organisms. Brewer's yeast is optimized for the production of alcohol, obviously, and to a lesser extent of carbon dioxide. Is that right? I think that's right? Yeah, carbonation, right? Yeah. Carbon dioxide, which is what, if you keep it under pressure for some time, this is what carbonates beer or sparkling wines, is the actual production of carbon dioxide. And if you keep that under pressure, then which you can't do the whole time, you have to let it, anyway, that's probably going into too much detail, but like during the fermentation, it's going to release a ton of CO2. And then at a later stage, if you add a little bit more sugar and you seal it, then the fermentation will continue, and that will produce the carbonation of beer or sparkling wine that is made in a traditional way. Of course, today you can just take carbon dioxide and put the liquid under pressure with it, and that will also carbonate it. How did I get there? I feel like I've really gone off piste with this. Wine and beer, distilled spirits, yeast, strengths of different alcohols. Yeah, so Slingerland thinks that distilled spirits are very dangerous. I feel like I've kind of like talked around a lot of the stuff that he's done. I haven't probably done a great job of doing an actual book review. But I'm going to just kind of say, I think I'm going to, because it's been almost an hour, I'm going to kind of just jump through. I'll just try and quickly say what the overall structure of the book is in case you're interested. And then I'll go to some of his conclusions, because his conclusions are really fascinating as well. First, I highly recommend this book. If you have any interest in alcohol or intoxicants of any kind, it's really an eye-opener in terms of how it's worked over history. And it's just a very fun read. He's a very good writer. It's a great book. So chapter 1, why do we get drunk? Slingerland thinks there has to be good prose. As I said at the beginning, bonding, creativity, reducing stress, increasing trust, that kind of thing. 2, leaving the door open for Dionysus. I think this is his point what is this point? This is about the kind of neoteny stuff. So the idea that it lets you stay younger. It allows you to suspend the prefrontal cortex, and this allows more creativity out, or it allows different parts of the brain to operate. Now, I'm trying to see if there's anything else in this chapter. Communal bonding. Okay, I'm going to leave that one. Intoxication, ecstasy, and the origins of civilization. So this is the point that the beer before bread thing, and also that civilization may come together in order, like it may to be able to trust people from different groups and kind of to cooperate on a large scale may require you to get kind of messed up in order to trust people, because it's not obvious that we should be, there are these other apes that have these stricter dominance hierarchies and they're always fighting. And part of his argument is humans do that less because they stay younger for longer. And one way they do this is through intoxicants. I think that's overall the point of that one. Intoxication and the modern world. So let's see. Oh yeah. So he talks a lot about how creativity can be enhanced by people drinking together. So there's a fascinating one where he shows that, I'm not sure if it's his research, I think it's someone else's, but he cites a study in which counties in the US that go dry, actually their number of patents go down temporarily, and then they come back eventually. And the kind of surmise behind this is that by that point, there's kind of speakeasies and people find a new pattern and place of where to meet people to drink. And the reason that he's saying this is because he does think that drinking together in groups produces types of creativity. He points out that Google and, other tech companies that you might not expect to do this still really encourage, they have like a whole whiskey room in Google or something like that. And tech is known, I didn't know this, but tech is quite known for drinking a lot. I worked in media and in finance, which are also very much like, it's actually hard to I would think it would be hard to get promoted within some of these industries. That's kind of messed up. He talks about how that's messed up and how, like, ways that we might alter that kind of thing. He also talks about the fact that it kind of has this danger of becoming this old boys club because of gender norms and things like that, that it may be more acceptable for men to go to the pub after work and drink and get really drunk. And so there may be like a kind of bias for various reasons. It may be riskier for women to do that. So the point is that he still thinks that it's not just this evolutionary hangover, but there's still good reasons to drink today. He thinks the need for ecstasy is a desire for play, like the desire for play is basic to all humans. So I'm just kind of going through chapter 4, intoxication in the modern world, in my Readwise notes. And yeah, at the same time, lots of cultures have these taboos about it. Like alcohol has always faced legislation. No one thinks you should drink all the time. And he actually goes into really fascinating traditional rituals, which basically in most old societies, there was ways of controlling how much alcohol people took. For the Greeks, they considered it barbarous to drink undiluted wine. They also apparently had these extremely shallow glasses so that like if you were too drunk, you would just spill the wine, I guess. And there are other extremely ritual bound societies like extremely ritual bound practices around alcohol. He talks about ancient China, where the host is the only one who is allowed to raise a toast. And this allows him to precisely calibrate, like the amount of alcohol that people take. And no one is allowed to drink except during toasts. And there's other ways. He talks about Norwegian sort of teenagers who intervene when they start seeing people, what we used to call pre-gaming, which is basically just drinking a bunch before you went out. The US is what he would call a northern drinking culture, which I'm not going to remember the name of the researcher, but there's this contrast between Southern Europe, where they drink from a young age, they drink very moderately, they always drink with meals, they don't like getting drunk is very culturally inappropriate, and they there are kind of rituals around it. Like, it's like, it would be weird not to drink one glass of wine with the meal, but it would also be like really weird to drink like 3 or something like that. And whereas in these northern cultures, like drinking is usually separated from eating. It is done for its own sake. Often people get very drunk. There's fewer taboos about drinking. You can think about places like Germany, Netherlands, the UK, most of the Scandinavian countries. But he does note that in Norway, there are some norms around this. And I've also heard that in Norway, like the bar people are supposed to like stop you from, if they decide you're too drunk, they'll just cut you off. Whereas he talks about this kind of conflict you have in the States between, bartenders wanting to get tipped, and so that therefore wanting to serve you, but then also the dangers that come with people that are very drunk, including fighting and drunk driving and all that kind of stuff. Chapter 5, the dark side of Dionysus. So he does spend one chapter on some of the issues with drinking alcohol, and that is probably better known. I think that's why he leaves it to the end. He doesn't go into a huge amount of detail, but he does have some interesting reflections. And then the conclusion, like this is actually, I'm kind of tempted to leave it there, but his conclusion, there are actually some very interesting things in there. I'll just give you one as a kind of teaser. He thinks distilled spirits should be taxed at a much higher rate than beer and wine, and that maybe higher alcohol things should be taxed more generally. Some countries, I think, already do this. But he thinks it should be extreme to kind of like really reduce how much spirits are available. and that you shouldn't drink spirits before you're 25 years old. And he thinks this is because the prefrontal cortex is like formed at that point, and the distilled spirits just like destroy it or like knock it out. And there is this kind of like, I kind of think he might be right, actually, like that if you were to start drinking weak beers or diluted wine at like 12, and not drinking to get drunk, because I know other people who have, other friends who have ended up having problems with alcohol who drank to get drunk from like a very, very young age. I'm in the UK, so of course there's people like that. The US has this as well. The US is like this weird Jekyll and Hyde thing going on where they have one of the highest percentages of like total abstinence. It's like 30-40% or something. But then they also have like terrible alcohol problems for the people that do drink. And so, yeah, one idea is like introduce people young, make sure they're very, very aware of the dangers of alcohol, do these rituals that basically keep it constrained so that that one person is not deciding how drunk they get. And that if people do start drinking distilled spirits, they do it once their brains are fully formed, because the prefrontal cortex also determines your control over stuff as well. So, if you're kind of messing with that at a young age, then it may lead to kind of the addiction problems or something like that. Okay. That has been a long and maybe not that specific review, in the sense that I'm not sure I actually gave a great insight into what the book does as a whole. But I am, in case you missed the beginning, I am hosting an event tonight with Ed Slingerland in London. DM me on Twitter if you have not heard about that and would like to get signed up for that. I will post my Twitter. That is my Twitter, and it's also in the chat. And I will also, I'm not sure where you're watching this from. I think at least one person seems to be watching from Twitch. This is going out also to my YouTube channel, where it will stay up. I don't really understand Twitch, but I kind of think that videos don't really stay up there. You can let me know in the chat if that is wrong. And then finally, I do have a Patreon where I'm going to post this, and it's kind of where I frequently post things. If you would like to support me, that would be amazing. But also you can just check it to find out what exactly I've been up to, because I do post, I try to post everything that I'm doing, whether it's podcasts or blog posts or even Twitter threads or videos like this one. So I hope you have enjoyed my rambling talk about alcohol, its history, and the general topic of intoxicants in connection with Edward Slingerland's book, Drunk, which is subtitled How We Sipped, Danced, and Stumbled Our Way to Civilization. And that book is available on Amazon and various other places. I should probably just link to the book, shouldn't I? Because that would be a helpful thing for you potentially, in case you're like, what is this book that he's been talking about for an hour and where do I buy it? Then I will tell you, you can get it on Amazon. Has it? Yeah, let's see. Oh, it's actually saying 2022. I said it came out last year. I could be completely wrong. Hardcover, let's see. Oh no, yeah. So hardcover, 15th of July, 2021. It's the paperback that's about to come out in 2 months. So I think that's why I had it in my head that this is still in the process of coming out. And I am going to also send you the link to that book. That is the link in the chat. I don't know how that shows up on YouTube. If you've been watching it later, I will just put the little thing up in the corner here. So that is my description of Edward Slingerland's Drunk. I hope you enjoyed what I said about it, and I'm going to leave it there. Thanks so much for watching, and let's talk soon. Feel free to DM me on Twitter. I am on Twitter there. If you ever have any questions, I will also take them in the chat. And yeah, thank you so much for watching.